Hi there, my name's Bruce Rain from Breakers Creations, and in this video I'll be benchmarking the SCSI2SD SCSI hard drive emulator. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to
smash that like button. This video is brought to you by PCBWay, the first choice for PCB prototyping. When I decided to try making my own SCSI2SDs, I uploaded the Gerber files, was able to see a preview of the finished product, the price was sensational, and the turnaround was just 24 hours. It took less than a week to get my boards made and delivered to me here in Australia, which is just amazing. So check out PCBWay.com today.
Ever since I posted my SCSI2SD review video, people have been asking me exactly how fast the SCSI2SD is, and could I do a benchmarking video. The only thing that stopped me from doing this is that I knew it would be a huge undertaking, and couldn't be restricted to a single model of SCSI2SD or to a single computer, and would need to explore a variety of different settings. So, over the last few weeks, I've done my best to try and put together a reasonable picture of just how fast a SCSI2SD really is. Firstly, let's get a few things out of the way. SD cards are not SSDs. They are not really designed to be used as hard drives, and you certainly wouldn't do so on a modern computer. Or if you did, the performance expectation would be pretty low. But when you're using an SD card with a 30-year-old computer and your performance baseline is one of these old spinners, they actually work quite well. But don't expect to be blown away in the same way you would if you replaced an old mechanical hard drive with an SSD. In fact, in some of my tests on the slower Macs, such as sequential reads, the SD card was actually slower than a mechanical drive. But in random reads, it left the old mechanical drive for dead, because there's no mechanical head having to zip back and forward across a drive's surface. I tested 5 separate models of SCSI2SD: the 4.2, the 5.0, the 5.2, the 5.5, and the 6. The SCSI2SD was conceived by Michael McMaster. In the early days, all of his designs and source code were released under the GPL license, allowing anyone to build their own SCSI2SD using his designs. The SCSI2SD 4.2 is the last of the SCSI2SDs released under the GPL license. This particular one was assembled by me. The version 5.0 is a later revision of the SCSI2SD and is still available to purchase from ITEAD in China. As you can see, the design is far more compact than the original version 4.2. The version 5.1 was a redesign of the SCSI2SD and brought quite a lot of differences. I didn't test with the version 5.1 because it has since been superseded by the version 5.2. The 5.2 has some really nifty stuff built in, which will be bringing some great new features to the SCSI2SD in the future. From a performance perspective, it's pretty much identical to the version 5.1. The version 5.5 is much smaller and is designed to be used externally. I can't begin to tell you just how useful this little guy is, especially if you want to transfer large amounts of data to and from different SCSI-based Macs, or to be able to boot from an external SCSI device. And lastly, the version 6 is the latest revision of the SCSI2SD. All of the previously mentioned SCSI2SDs use this controller chip here. It's a Cypress CY8C5267-LP051 ARM PSOC, or Programmable System on a Chip. Basically, it's like a little computer all crammed into a single chip. It has a CPU, RAM and storage, and it can be programmed to do all sorts of tasks. And in this instance, it's been programmed to emulate a SCSI hard drive. However, the version 6 is different and uses these two chips here. A Lattice ICE40HX1K-VQ100 and an STI ARM STM32F205. As a result, the V6 has a few extra features. Firstly, it's faster than the others. It can provide asynchronous transfers for devices that support it, and it will mount the first drive on the SD card onto your computer's desktop when you plug it in via the USB port. There are a number of other differences too, but this video is all about speed rather than features. I tested on 3 different vintage Macs. A Centris 660AV that's been upgraded to a Quadra 660AV, which has a 25 MHz 68040 CPU, a PowerMac 6166, which has a 66 MHz 601 PowerPC CPU, and a PowerMac 7600, which would normally have a PowerPC 604 CPU, but mine has a 300 MHz G3 CPU installed. I used this 1GB Quantum Fireball mechanical hard drive as the baseline for the test. This drive performs pretty well within its class, so it provides a good challenge for the SCSI2SD. All drives I tested, whether mechanical or SD, were formatted with Hard Disk Toolkit version 1.8. Formatting software can have an impact on drive performance, so this is an important point. All 3 computers were running System 7.5 and the benchmarking was performed using MacBench version 4. MacBench has a disk speed test that runs a series of different reading and writing tasks and then provides an overall speed rating of the drive. But I also ran a couple of other tests so that I could see exactly where the SCSI2SD performed well and where it didn't. There are also a number of different configurable settings on the SCSI2SD, so I ran tests to see which ones had an impact on performance. I used a SanDisk Ultra Micro SD card for the majority of testing, which claims to have up to 80 megabytes per second maximum read speed, but they don't provide any documentation on the write speed. But as a Class 10 card, it should provide at least 10 megabytes a second continuous write. To test whether the speed of the card made a difference, I used a SanDisk Extreme, which claims 160 megabytes a second maximum read and 60 megabytes a second maximum write speed. This whole benchmarking process took me absolutely ages, but I did it so that you wouldn't have to, and I do hope it answers any and all questions you might have about SCSI2SD speed and performance. So let's have a look at the results. Okay, so here are the Quadra 660AV results. And at the moment I've only got 2 loaded, but I've got the Quantum Fireball hard drive as our baseline. And then I've got the SCSI2SD version 4.2. And this is with all the default settings. And as you can see in the standard disk benchmarking test, they come out equally. But if we have a look a little bit deeper, you can see that they're actually quite different. The SCSI2SD version 4.2 is quite a lot slower in sequential reads than the Quantum Fireball. But when we start looking at the random reads, and further down here, the random writes, for certainly some of them anyway, the SCSI2SD actually is far superior to the Quantum Fireball. And when it averages all that out, we basically end up with them appearing like they are equally matched, even though they have very different strengths and weaknesses. So this next one is labeled here S2 plus C, which basically means SCSI2 plus the cache. And these are 2 settings within the SCSI2SD utility that I have switched on for this test. Now, SCSI2 you wouldn't really expect to make any difference on this computer, but the cache probably makes a little difference here and there. And as you can see, we're a few percent more. It's only 3%. I'm not sure how much I would read into that, but it does appear to have made a little bit of a difference. It's my understanding that there are no real problems associated with enabling SCSI2. So even if your old computer can't utilize it, I'd switch it on anyway. The cache, on the other hand, can be problematic. If you were to get some sort of hardware or power failure while the SCSI2SD is transferring data, it can cause corruption. So while it may slightly increase the speed, there are risks involved. Okay, in this next one, the XTR, the label on here, basically means that this test was run using a SanDisk Extreme SD card rather than the SanDisk Ultra. And as you can see, it really hasn't made a lot of difference. The improvement of 1%, I don't really read too much into improvements of such a small amount. So that XD card hasn't made much of a difference, which suggests to me that there is a bottleneck somewhere. I don't know exactly where that bottleneck is, but that faster SD card really didn't make much of a difference on this particular computer and this particular SCSI2SD at all. Okay, now we are looking at the settings of the SCSI2SD version 5.0, and it is virtually a carbon copy of the version 4.2, which is not terribly surprising. They are very, very similar, even though they look quite different. Once again, the blue line is the Quantum Fireball as the baseline. Then we have the default settings as the red line here. And then we have with the SCSI2 and cache switched on as the green one. And we have the SanDisk Extreme card for the yellow line. Okay, now we're looking at the results of the SCSI2SD version 5.2. And if you have a version 5.1, this is what you really should be looking at, because these two are very, very similar. Now, it's very, very similar to what we've seen before. It's actually showing it's 1% less than the Quantum Fireball here on its default settings, whereas the other ones were showing us that they were neck and neck. Again, I don't really read much into those very small fluctuations in percentages, where we're talking about 1% either way. So once again, looking at this version 5.2, we're pretty much looking at the same sort of result as we were getting from the version 4.2 and the version 5.0, which is not really surprising given that they're all using the same controller chip. Okay, and now we're looking at the SCSI2SD version 5.5. Now, as you can see, it's a very different result to the previous ones. And it's not that surprising. A lot of anecdotal evidence has basically said that the version 5.5 is slower than the others, and the bench tests basically prove that. I don't know if that's because of something to do with the way it is made, or whether it's because it's running externally, but as you can see, it is slower than the Quantum Fireball in these tests. Now, having said that, it is still faster than the Quantum Fireball in some of these tests, like some of these random reads, once again, because it's a solid state device. But in some of these other tests, it is definitely significantly slower than the other SCSI2SDs. But of course, whatever the SCSI2SD version 5.5 might lack in speed, it really makes up for in convenience. So here is the SCSI2SD version 6, and as you can see, it looks quite different. Now, I should mention the SCSI2SD utility version 6, because it is different to the previous version. It does have the ability to enable or disable SCSI2, but it also has these different speed options. The first one is no limit safe. It sounds nice. Then we have asynchronous 1.5 megabytes a second, asynchronous 3.3 megabytes a second, and asynchronous 5 megabytes a second. Now, these old Macs can't handle asynchronous transfer, so I haven't bothered to do any tests with these. But then we have synchronous 5 megabytes a second and synchronous 10 megabytes a second. Now, I have done tests for each of these speeds. Now, I don't know if it's going to make much of a difference, because in theory, if it says no limit, we should be working at its maximum speed. These are where you're actually setting the SCSI2SD to a specific speed limit. So, in theory, no limit should be the fastest, but we'll wait and see what the tests say. Then we've got turbo less reliable. That sounds a little bit foreboding. I haven't bothered to test with that because I'm not a big fan of anything called less reliable. So now looking at these results, the version 6 is just basically on the default settings. Then the version 6 S2 is where I've switched SCSI2 on. And then we have SCSI2 plus 5 megabytes a second. And as you can see, all three of those are identical. None of those settings are making any difference to the end result on this old computer. Then we've got the 5 megabytes a second using the SanDisk Extreme card. And this has actually seen a slight improvement from 135% to 139%. So certainly on the version 6, it would appear that the faster SD card is having an effect on the results. Then we have the SCSI2 plus 10 megabytes a second, and a slight improvement there. And then 10 megabytes a second plus the SanDisk Extreme card. It's saying 1% less, but I don't think it's actually 1% less. It's probably just a fluctuation. I think we're probably looking at those all being around about the same speed. So no doubt about the fact that the results for the version 6 are very different to the previous versions. And it is clearly the fastest one out of the range, even running on this old 68040 Mac. Okay, so now let's put all of these SCSI2SDs up against each other on the Quadra 660 AV.
And as you can see, the version 4.2, the version 5.0, and the version 5.2, the first three here, they're all basically reading the same performance result. There's a 1% difference here on the 5.2, but as I said, I don't really read that much into such minor fluctuations. The version 5.5 is obviously the slowest here, and the version 6 is the fastest. So yeah, even on these old Macs, the version 6 is clearly the winner out of all the SCSI2SDs. So now we're looking at the PowerMac 6100 and looking at the SCSI2SD version 4.2. Now, all of these results are faster than we were getting on the Quadra 660 AV, which is not surprising. It's a faster computer. If we have a look here at 100% for the Quantum Fireball as our baseline, when we're using the SCSI2SD with its default settings, it's actually a little bit slower than the Quantum Fireball. But once we switch on the SCSI2 and the cache, you can see that it does pick up. It is now faster than the Quantum Fireball. And when we use the SanDisk Extreme card for this final result here, it's showing a little bit slower. So again, I'm not really sure what to read into that. There's obviously a bottleneck somewhere. But you can see here, if you look at the random reads, really big speed differences here with the SCSI2SD over the Quantum Fireball. And here are the results of the SCSI2SD version 5.0. Once again, we're seeing virtually the same thing that we're seeing on the 4.2. It's pretty much the same device, just looks different. And here is the SCSI2SD version 5.2. Now, the unusual difference we're seeing here is that with the SCSI2 and cache switched on, it's actually a little bit slower. And once again, I don't know if that is a fluctuation or something that went wrong during the testing itself, but that's the result we've got there. But other than that, results pretty much the same as the other ones. And here's the poor old version 5.5. Once again, it's the slowest one of the bunch. Definitely a benefit for switching on the SCSI2 and the cache on this computer, but it is still definitely the slowest of the SCSI2SDs. Alright, and here is the SCSI2SD version 6. And as you can see, once again, this one is the winner. It is faster than the Quantum Fireball even on its default settings. Once we switch on the SCSI2 setting, a big jump there. Where we limit it to the 5 megabytes a second, it's around about the same. If we use the Extreme card, the SanDisk Extreme card, you can see we are actually getting an improvement here of a few percent. And then we've got the 10 megabits a second. It's giving us the same result as the 5 megabits a second, so I suspect, and pretty much the same result as no limit, so I don't think that makes any difference. But the SanDisk Extreme card is definitely improving. You can see here on the purple line and on the pink line here where we've got the XTR, they are the fastest ones of the tests here. So the SanDisk Extreme card definitely making a small improvement in speed there. And here are the 5 SCSI2SDs up against each other, and I'm not quite sure why, but the SCSI2SD version 5.2 is actually coming out a few percent lower than the 4.2 and the version 5.0. I don't know if that's an anomaly in the actual test that was done, or whether it is actually a little bit slower than the other ones. The version 5.5, as usual, is the slowest that we would see, and the SCSI2SD version 6 is the fastest. So that's what the 5 different models look like together on the 6100. Now it's time for the 7600 results, and we are once again starting with the SCSI2SD version 4.2. Now, interestingly enough, I get the same result when I have the SCSI2 and cache switched off. I'm not really sure why that's the case, but as you can see here from the results, the default settings with SCSI2 and cache switched off are virtually the same as SCSI2 and cache switched on, and same with the Extreme card as well, the SanDisk Extreme card. We're just getting the same result here. But as you can see, it's a pretty awesome result. 167, 169, 168%, so nearly 170% over the Quantum Fireball speed. Now the 7600 does have a faster internal SCSI bus to the other ones, and as you can see that the SCSI2SD is a lot faster on this computer. And once again, testing the SCSI2SD version 5.0, and it's pretty much a carbon copy of the 4.2. And here is the SCSI2SD version 5.2, and it is also a carbon copy of the 4.2 and the 5.0. And here's the old SCSI2SD version 5.5, and as expected, it is slower than the others, but it's still faster than the Quantum Fireball. So that's a pretty good result. Alright, and here is the version 6, and as you can see, it is absolutely blitzing the Quantum Fireball. That's nearly 2.8 times the speed of it. Once again, these different settings aren't really making a whole lot of difference, but we are getting a little bit more on this purple bar and on this pink bar. They are the ones using the SanDisk Extreme card, and we are seeing a little bit of a speed increase for those. So once again, on the version 6, it is utilizing a faster SD card in there. And last of all, we have the SCSI2SDs up against each other. And we can see that the first three are pretty much the same. A couple of percent difference there for the version 5.0. And once again, I'm not going to read too much into that. The version 5.5 the slowest, and the version 6 the fastest. So now it all comes down to this one rather unattractive little chart. I've excluded the version 4.2 and version 5, given that their results were virtually identical to the version 5.2. So the left axis is the Macbench disk score, and the higher the number, the faster the drive. We have results from the Quadra 660AV, the PowerMac 6100, and the PowerMac 7600, grouped by the four devices: the Quantum Fireball, the SCSI2SD version 5.2, version 5.5, and version 6. As you can see, in each instance, the faster the computer, the better the results. The little white line running through the bars indicates the speed of the baseline Quantum Fireball on that device. So starting with the Quadra 660AV, the version 5.2 is virtually identical to the Fireball. The version 5.5 is slower, and the version 6 is faster. For the PowerMac 6100, the version 5.2 is a little faster than the Fireball, the version 5.5 is slower, and the version 6 is quite a bit faster. For the PowerMac 7600, the version 5.2 is a lot faster than the Fireball, the version 5.5 is a little faster, and the version 6 is almost 3 times faster.
So, in summary, if it's speed you want, spend those extra dollars on the SCSI2SD version 6. If you're not too concerned about speed and want the convenience of the compact external form factor, go with the version 5.5. And if you're just looking for a replacement that's comparable or a little faster than your original hard drive, go with the version 5.2. You can buy a SCSI2SD from Inertial Computing in the US, or if you're in Australia, you can buy them from me. There are links in the description. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.